up planting a tree in my backyard a while back, and I kid you not, I spent like an hour going down a rabbit hole of zoning regulations and permit requirements. I mean, what?
Yeah, it's amazing how complicated it can get. And this is exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're tackling land use and growth regulations in Washington state.
Right, focusing on King County and specifically Duvall. And we've got a stack of documents here to help us unpack it all.
We've got the key terms, programs and reports, the rules. It's a lot.
It is. But the mission here is to make it clear. Like, if you're thinking about buying property, building something, or just curious about how local government works, it's for you.
Exactly. We're creating a roadmap to understanding how growth is actually managed.
And it seems like everything starts with these core concepts: land use and land capacity.
Definitely. Those are foundational.
Because ultimately, these concepts determine what gets built where and how cities like Duvall manage their growth sustainably.
Exactly. It's all about balanced growth and sustainability. And that's where those concepts come into play.
So before we even get into urban growth areas and growth targets and all that, we need to lay the groundwork.
Absolutely. And that starts with understanding existing conditions.
Right, like what's already on the ground.
Exactly. It's the starting point. What's the land currently being used for? What are its environmental features? What infrastructure is already there? All of that feeds into determining the land's capacity for development.
Okay, so it's about knowing what we're working with before we start making plans.
Yes. Think of it like building a house. You wouldn't build a skyscraper on a foundation meant for a bungalow, right?
Yeah.
You need to know what your foundation can handle.
Right, that makes sense. So existing conditions helps us understand that foundation.
Exactly. And it helps us understand the land's capacity for growth.
So, land capacity. How much development can a piece of land actually support? That's what we're talking about.
Precisely. It's like a carrying capacity for growth. We need to understand the limits and opportunities presented by the land itself.
So it's not just about whether or not there's physically empty space, but whether the existing infrastructure can handle more people.
Exactly. And that's where the Urban Growth Capacity Report comes in. It analyzes all sorts of factors to determine how much growth an area can handle.
Factors like what? Give us some examples.
Well, everything from the availability of land zoned for residential use to the capacity of roads, water systems, sewer systems, schools. It's about making sure the infrastructure can handle more people without being overwhelmed.
Makes sense. We don't want to create a whole bunch of problems just because we didn't think through the impact of more people.
Right. And it's not just about avoiding overloaded systems. It's also about preserving the character of a place and protecting its natural resources.
And that brings us to, I think, another key concept here: urban growth areas, UGAs.
Right.
UGAs, so it's kind of like we're drawing lines on a map, right? Like, okay, development can happen over here, but over there we want to preserve those rural areas and forests and farmlands.
Exactly. And that's a key goal of UGAs, to prevent that urban sprawl from just, gobbling up all the land.
So let's be honest.
Yeah.
Nobody really wants to live in a concrete jungle. We all need a little bit of nature.
I agree. And that's what's so important about these UGAs. They're trying to balance our need for housing and development with the need to protect the environment.
Speaking of balance, our documents mention zoning within UGAs. Like what can actually be built where? Houses, businesses, apartments.
Right. It gets pretty specific. And it's all about making sure that whatever gets built aligns with the overall vision for the area. Like you can't just decide to open up a gas station right in the middle of a residential zone.
Okay, so there are rules about what you can and can't do, even within those urban growth areas.
Exactly, and for good reason, right? We need to think about the impact on the community, on traffic, on the environment. It's not just about individual plots of land, it's about the bigger picture.
Right, makes sense.
Okay.
And speaking of the bigger picture, our documents also talk about these growth targets. It seems like we're setting a course for the future, like Duvall. We expect you to accommodate X number of new residents over the next 20 years. Is that kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like planning a dinner party. You need to have an idea of how many guests to expect so you can, buy enough food, make sure you have enough chairs.
So we need to make sure Duvall has enough chairs, enough houses, schools, parks, all of that for everyone who's going to be living there in the future.
Precisely. And those growth targets, they're not just random numbers. They're based on a lot of research, a lot of analysis of population trends, economic forecast, even things like climate change and its potential impacts.
Right. So it's about trying to anticipate the future as best we can and making sure Duvall has the resources and infrastructure to support a growing population.
Exactly. And it's not just about the next couple of years either. We're talking about decades here, right?
That's where that 20-year planning cycle comes in, right? Like what we do today has a ripple effect on the future.
Exactly. It's all about thinking long-term, making sure that the decisions we make today create a sustainable and livable community for future generations. So these 20-year plans, they get reviewed and updated regularly to make sure we're on track.
Makes sense. We don't want to just set it and forget it. We need to be adaptable and adjust our plans as needed.
Absolutely. Now, to actually put all of these plans into action, we need to look at the specific programs and laws that make it all happen. One of these is the Buildable Lands Program, which plays a vital role in making sure we have enough land zoned and ready for all those new homes and businesses we're expecting.
Okay, so we've talked about these growth targets, but they're meaningless if there's nowhere to actually build, right?
Right. We need to make sure we actually have enough land zoned and available for all that growth, and that's where the Buildable Lands Program comes in.
It's like taking inventory, right? Making sure our cupboards are stocked for that party we're planning.
Exactly. It's all about being proactive, making sure we're prepared for the growth that's coming our way.
So it's like a reality check. Like, okay, we want all these people to be able to live in Duvall, but do we actually have the space for them?
And not just space, we also need to think about the infrastructure, the environmental impacts. And all of that is factored into that urban growth capacity report we talked about earlier. It's like a city's credit score for growth.
A credit score for growth. I like that.
Right. Just like a lender looks at your financial history to decide how much risk they're taking on this report, looks at factors like available land, infrastructure capacity, environmental constraints, all to assess how much growth a city can handle responsibly.
So it's about balancing the desire for growth with the need to be responsible and sustainable.
Precisely. And it's about making sure that growth benefits everyone, not just a select few.
That's so important. So it's not just about avoiding growing pains like traffic jams and overcrowded schools, but about making sure that new development doesn't harm the environment or put a strain on our resources like water.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where growth can happen without compromising the things that make a place livable and sustainable in the long run. And speaking of sustainability, all these efforts we've been discussing, planning for growth, protecting natural resources, they're all guided by a really important piece of legislation here in Washington, the Growth Management Act, or GMA for short.
Oh yeah, the GMA. I've heard of that, but honestly, I'm a little fuzzy on the details. It's mentioned a lot in this laws and rules document.
It's a big one. Basically, the GMA, it was enacted back in 1990, and it was a huge deal. It was meant to address the issue of sprawl, protect our natural resources, and promote more efficient and sustainable growth.
So it's like the rule book for how counties and cities manage growth.
Exactly. It sets the ground rules for everyone to follow.
One thing that caught my eye in the document was the emphasis on protecting drinking water sources, which, seems pretty important.
Absolutely essential, and the GMA addresses this directly by requiring cities and counties to designate and protect critical areas, things like wetlands and aquifers and fish habitats.
So those areas are kind of like the VIP zones. They get special protection.
Exactly, and for good reason. These areas are essential for maintaining our water quality and ecological health. And the GMA, it mandates that any development in or around these areas has to be super carefully managed to minimize any negative impacts.
So it's not just about saying no to development altogether, but about figuring out smarter, more environmentally sensitive ways to build.
Precisely. And that often requires working together, collaborating across city and county boundaries.